Sometimes I like to lie. After my last book review, I went to research if there are any other Drag Race specific books that I could read and review for the channel, because I gotta use my master's degree somehow, and I was recommended the book Legendary Children, The First Decade of RuPaul's Drag Race and the Last Century of Queer Life by Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez. The fact that the title of this book is longer than Robbie Turner's post-Drag Race career in drag should have been the first red flag. But I was interested, because the cover is really inviting. There's Ru, there's Divine, Crystal Abeja, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Tim Curry as Frankenfurter, and some other people I could not recognize but that I assumed I would learn about in this book. Yes, I judged the book by its cover and decided to purchase it and read it. To be fair, it is an interesting read and a good starting point for further exploration on queer history in the US. But did this book need to exist? Did it need to be marketed as a book about the first decade of Drag Race first and a story about important queer figures of the 20th century second? I don't think so. I'm gonna read you my brief review of the book that I left on Goodreads. It's kinda ironic that this book is marketed to an extent as a book about Drag Race, while it simply uses most basic aspects of Drag Race as starting points for the talk about the history of queer culture. It's even more ironic that the bits about Drag Race are riddled with errors that could have been easily fact-checked, while the longer parts of the book about queer culture's history are annoyingly US-centric. The authors also minimize the importance and presence of cis queer women and trans men in queer history, and are often hypocritical in a way that only SJW teenagers, derogatory, can be, such as saying that Madonna appropriated queer culture for her song Vogue, saying that club kids stole from other cultures, having an entire chapter about how the pit crew is actually subversive, etc. Also, Latinx. Say this to a Spanish-speaking person outside of the USA and they will, deservingly so, laugh in your face. However, the book does offer some good information and lists further reading/viewing material, even though nothing quoted in the book is ever properly referenced. This very important person said this important thing in an interview. What interview? Where was it published? When was it published? Can I find it digitally, or is it in print or video/audio form? Before we continue, I just want to say that if you would like to help the channel, since YouTube hates its creators, you can like or dislike this video, leave a comment, and of course, make sure you're subscribed. You can also become a member of the channel, and I want to thank all of these lovely people here who have become members so far. They have seen this video before the rest of you, and they already have other videos to watch. Some of those videos being channel exclusive content. Now, let's get back to the book. A book about Drag Race, this is not. It is, however, a book about aspects of queer culture in the US that later are incorporated into Drag Race simply because it is a reality show about a drag competition. Therefore, for this review, I will mostly focus on the aspects of the book that have to deal with Drag Race. However, I do want to mention something that might be considered an elitist opinion. Not everyone should write books the same way that you would not come to me to ask how to build a car. The authors of this book, Tom Fitzgerald and Lorenzo Marquez, are a couple, and quoting the About Us section from their website, they have a background in film, music, fashion, and advertising. What this background is, it's not specified. Did they simply work in these fields, or did they go to school for and specialize in the said fields? Who knows? The author of the previous book on Drag Race that I reviewed is a journalist, so someone who knows how to research and write, or it's assumed that she knows to do that because she's a journalist. Ironically, these two write similarly to the said previous author in that sort of J.K. Rowling style of writing, where you're forcing the reader to have a certain voice in mind when reading. The voice in this context is a Drag Race fan who serves tea and clocks divas. Quote, tucked and contoured, corseted and wigged. She's got a look LEWK, sure to make those other bitches gag, and a catchphrase just waiting to spring forth from her lips that she's hoping will brand her to the fan base for the rest of her career. End quote. Just because you're a gay man who watched MTV does not mean you're qualified to write a book on the century of queer life, which again is presented as US-centric, but rarely is it aware of that. Quote, for the majority of the 20th century, it was illegal for a man to appear in public wearing women's clothing. It was illegal for men to have sex with other men, and the mere act of flirting could land a man in jail or a mental institution, or have him medicated against his will. It was illegal to produce or distribute any work that depicted same-sex desires, and it was illegal for bars and restaurants to serve alcohol to gay or lesbian patrons. End quote. And so on and so on. In the passage I just read, they don't mention that this is how it was in the USA, but how it is in a lot of parts of the world. But they do acknowledge it later once. Other than this nod to the fact that there's a world of queer people outside of the US, the rest of the book still talks about queer life as a universal thing, rather than categorically mentioning only some parts of the English-speaking world. Furthermore, even the parts of the book that are about the first decade of Drag Race are riddled with errors that any fan of the show can clock immediately. It's admirable, however, that the authors recognize that Drag Race is a representation of, quote, gay male social culture, end quote. But that raises the following question. Why are we framing the presentation of queer life with something that's representative of just one part of queer people? Luckily, they do define what they mean by queer culture by saying, quote, that's not necessarily the same thing as queer equality or legal protections, nor does it encompass the broad spectrum of queer existence. It's the shared culture created or curated by queer people for queer people, arising out of our experiences as queer people. End quote. I don't want to make it seem like I'm shitting on the authors. There are just some very obvious issues throughout the book, especially in its concept. It is an easy read, however, a coffee table book, not serious literature. But what I'm trying to say is, and to borrow from Peppermint,
Michelle says no to everything. Michelle, you like my dress? No. You like my makeup? No. Bitch, where the hell were you when somebody asked you if you wanted to write that book?
The book is divided into 10 chapters, excluding the introduction, further reading, acknowledgements, and the index of names and concepts mentioned in the book. Each chapter talks about an aspect of Drag Race, and then relates it to a part of history of queer life in the USA or other English-speaking parts of the world, namely just the UK, mentioning important figures, why they're important, and then very loosely connecting them to Drag Race. For example, the first chapter is about the workroom, which is then related to Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. The relation here being that the workroom is like a shelter or a space for queer people to gather, help each other out and coexist, but also it's somewhere where they can be catty without the problems of the outside world affecting them. Just how Marsha and Sylvia helped queer people and took them in. Question mark? It feels a little forced, if not downright disrespectful. The other chapters talk about, in order, reading in general, but relating it to the reading mini challenge. Snatch Game, relating it to drag being heavily influenced by pop culture, but also celebrity impersonation, acting challenges, and queer people in film, television, theater, solo acts, and so on. Singing challenges, and queer people in music. The pit crew and the ideals of beauty for gay men, paired with erotica and art that depicted it, the runway and the relation of queer self-expression to it, the history of lip-syncing, which I actually think is a great and very informative chapter, assuming that all of the information given here is correct. The concept of queer families, and here they've already given up on relating the book to Drag Race, and political activism of queer people, which arguably has nothing to do with Drag Race, though some people might say that it has everything to do with Drag Race because symbolically, drag inherently is is political. I've quite snarkily but purposely said, assuming that all of the information given here is correct, because there are a lot of errors regarding Drag Race that even the most casual of fans would be able to correct. All of these mistakes put into question everything else that's in the book. How can I trust you to tell me about a poorly documented case of a gay man who performed over 80 years ago when you can't even get right when Sasha Velour's famous rose petals reveal happened? I'll leave a list on the screen of further reading or viewing that the authors themselves have left in the book so that you can watch or read those sources instead of purchasing and reading this book, because otherwise it would be a complete nightmare to read a 250-page book and then have to fact-check every single thing you read. Although, to be fair, the authors do say in the introduction, quote, "We want you to grab your phone and look up any of the people or events mentioned in this book whenever the curiosity strikes you." End quote. So I would like to mention and correct all of the mistakes regarding Drag Race that I have caught in the book, though I don't know if I caught all of them. In the first chapter, they talk about the mirror message on Drag Race, which the queens leave after their elimination. The authors write the following, quote, "In the 1960 film Butterfield 8, the dragfully named Gloria Wondrous, played by Elizabeth Taylor, wanders the lush, empty apartment of the married man with whom she just spent the night. Gloria is horrified to discover that her lover has slipped $250 into her handbag with a note asking if it's enough. Angered and hurt, she takes out her lipstick and scrawls 'No sale' on the grand gilded mirror of his living room before storming out." End quote. Later, they also write, quote, "Diana Ross was starring in Lady Sings the Blues as a legendary jazz singer Billie Holiday. In one of the film's most memorable scenes, Billie's backstage after having been attacked by the Klan, sitting before a makeup mirror, lightening her skin with powder and crumbling under the weight of heartbreak, addiction, and unrelenting hatred and racism. She reaches for her tube of lipstick, and before she knows what she's doing, she's scrawling her inner feelings wordlessly across the mirror. A streak of greasy pink rage." End quote. After the first quote about Elizabeth Taylor's character, the authors write, quote, "Is it any wonder Ru would make his queen sign off from the show in the same way, paying tribute to one of the great Hollywood fruit flies of all time?" End quote. While later, after the bit about Diana Ross, they write, quote, "It's certainly not for us to say that the lipstick on the mirror send-off that ends each episode of Drag Race and begins each subsequent one, as the queens react to it, was directly inspired by these two scenes, but it's hard not to see them as in the mix of the show's inspiration." End quote. So on one page they say what Ru's inspiration was for making queens do the mirror message, and on the next one they're unsure if that is what prompted it. All of this is false, mind you, as Ru had nothing to do with the mirror message. It was Shangela who started this tradition in season 2.
Did production tell you that, or was that something you were just like, I'm leaving something?
Well, no, production did not tell me that, and I never knew I was actually going to be starting a trend. I just didn't have a chance to talk to the girls again because, you know, they send you home. Mm-hmm. So I was like, oh, I want to leave them a note, but I didn't have like a pen and paper and, you know, before they started leaving notes in everyone's stations. So I thought, well, girl, I'm just going to leave them a message up here on the mirror, and they'll see it when they come back in.
They later also say that Shangela and Mimi Imfurst's fight in Untucked happened in season 4, which is a double mistake. Shangela and Mimi's fight happened during season 3, but that was season 2 of Untucked, since Untucked, the show, started with season 2 of Drag Race. The latter mistake we can forgive, as by this point we all refer to, let's say, season 10's Untucked as season 10 of Untucked, even though it's technically season 9 of Untucked. Next, in the chapter about Snatch Game, when they talk about celebrity impersonation and the challenge of Snatch Game itself, the authors write, quote, "So specific is the Snatch Game's required balance of comedy and mimicry that professional Janet Jackson impersonator Coco Montrese and professional Britney impersonator Derrick barely managed a mention for their efforts. Not because they did not look like Janet and Britney, but because they did not offer any sort of observation or hidden truth about them." End quote. They're right about Coco here, but Derrick was in the top 3 for her season Snatch Game, and she was praised for her portrayal of Britney. If they had wanted to mention 2 impersonations from queens that did not take it far enough for Snatch Game, why not go for Coco and Jolie, who did Taylor Swift for Snatch Game, but does her sometimes in real life as well, and she also was mid at Snatch Game. However, they clearly are not sure what season Coco was on, because they mentioned that she Jolie and Alyssa competed in season 4. Later, when they mention how a lot of iconic women of the 20th century who were queer icons were also portrayed on Snatch Game, they failed to mention Delta Works' Cher, only listing Chad Michaels' impersonation of her. You might say that this is because Delta's impersonation of Cher was bad, but the immediate next person they mention is Ivy Winters' portrayal of Marilyn Monroe. And after that, Mariah Perez Balenciaga's portrayal of Joan Crawford on the same Snatch Game Delta did Cher. We're still on Snatch Game with this next mistake. Well, not really a mistake, it's more so my nitpick. They talk about how Snatch Game at first was a challenge where only women could be portrayed, saying, quote, "There was a time when it was considered not just questionable or risky for a queen to portray a man on Snatch Game, but downright wrong." End quote. Jessica Wilde portrayed a man in the first ever Snatch Game. I need Drag Race and most of its audience to quickly learn the difference between sex, gender, and gender expression. I know I'm being extremely nitpicky here, but Drag Race does not have a problem with men or males, given that most of their contestants are men or males. They have a problem with masculinity, unless it's the pit crew and its exploitation of them, but we'll talk about that later. Later in the book, they say that the 9021 Ho challenge happened in season 7, even though it's a season 9 challenge, while also saying that Sasha Velour did her iconic roast battle reveal in the season 10 finale. Again, season 9. However, some mistakes are pretty questionable, and in the hands of teenage me would have been reasons for the cancellation of these two authors. There are two instances of these mistakes. The first comes in the chapter on acting challenges, where the authors quote a scene from the show. "I don't want to hear any more goddamn excuses. Fucking make it happen." Ru to Kennedy Davenport during the Shakespeare Challenge, season 7. End quote. Let's watch that part of the episode.
FYI for all of you girls up there, I don't want to hear any goddamn excuses. Be prepared.
We didn't have time to re-rehearse.
Make it work. Make it work. Fucking make it happen. I don't want to hear any goddamn excuses anymore.
Yeah, that was said to Jasmine Masters based on how the critiques were edited. Not Kennedy Davenport. To give the authors the benefit of the doubt, it's clear that there's editing magic happening in this episode, and it would make sense that this critique was given to everyone, but primarily Kennedy, who was the team leader. The second mistake is in regards to the Latrice versus Kenya lip sync from season 4. The authors write, quote, "What makes Latrice's performance of Aretha Franklin's You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman so iconic is not just the stunning depth of emotion she brought to the performance. It wasn't just how she used the natural shape of her body combined with acting and mimicry to get the audience to see her as a pregnant woman singing to her unborn child." End quote. While I do find it completely hilarious, and I low-key get why someone could make this mistake, Latrice did not use the natural shape of her body to resemble a pregnant woman. She was wearing a fake pregnancy belly. The authors also make a point here to say that pregnant drag was a comedy act half a century prior, but that in Latrice's scenario, it's not misogynistic anymore. You know, for a show that would not allow Manila to wear her period dress and where 5 drag queens, all 5 male, not men, but male, do not twist my words, cosplayed pregnancy for a makeover challenge with 5 men. Yeah, it's still misogynistic. I want to talk about the good parts of the book regarding Drag Race that actually taught me something, or that made me think of things in a different way. Since I started watching Drag Race in season 7, when Kennedy was called for wanting to do Little Richard for Snatch Game, I was aware of Drag Race's problem with what we would consider, I guess, male drag. Or rather, drag we're representing as a man, whether he be masculine or feminine. However, I was not aware of just how controversial it was for the queens to be seen out of drag in the workroom and in the confessionals back in season 1. In those earlier seasons, they also announced their government names, and the editors would do this transition from Javier to Rebecca, for example. I kind of miss this aspect of the show because fans tend to forget that For example, Onya Nurve is not a person, she's a drag queen character or a drag queen persona of Justin Woody. Drag Race has really blurred the lines of the persona and the person behind it, so much so that they feed into the parasocial relationships that underrepresented viewers have with the queens. The authors of the book also point out that the point of seeing queens in and out of drag is also because the transformation, the process of getting into drag, is also an important aspect of the show. Another thing from the early seasons that is gone from the show is...
Ooh, girl! You got she-mail.
A line that the queens would hear before getting a message from Ru, hinting at the next challenge. The authors write, quote, transgender writers, commenters, and activists called the show out for using an offensive slur against transgender women. Ru defended the use of the phrase by explaining that it was also historically a slur against drag queens and that he was just trying to reclaim it and strip it of its power to hurt. Transgender rights advocates countered that it was not his word to reclaim. End quote. So my thing is, the concept of reclaiming a slur, in theory, is stupid. In practice, it has been proven to be counterproductive. Therefore, it's stupid, where instead of taking away power from the word, you're normalizing its use with people who don't care if they'll hurt you by using it. Think of it this way, even if you don't plan on reading the paper that I've showed on screen, let's equate calling someone a slur to slapping them. A slur is a word that intends on hurting someone, as is a slap. You cannot slap someone and then go, oh, but I did not mean to hurt you. See, people have slapped me all my life. So to show them that I don't feel pain anymore from these slaps, now I slap others. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Earlier, I've criticized the authors on their comparison of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera's work to the concept of the workroom, but here they actually do make a good point about those early days of drag or early days of a drag queen, where you can see some relation of what they meant to say. Quote, every time you see a queen in the Drag Race workroom struggling to make a look out of scraps of pickings, they're paying tribute to all those street queens who had to pay it no mind and make do with whatever life laid at their feet. End quote. This is why, as they also point out, Ru roots for and likes those scrappy queens, like Chi-Chi DeVayne or Nina Bonina Brown. This is why I miss those less polished earlier seasons and challenges like Drag on a Dime, because they seem so much more organic than the overly polished but soulless product we've been watching for the past, 5-6 years or so? Another thing you could find on early seasons of Drag Race are queens not labeling themselves as drag queens, but rather as female impersonators. Now, I have a huge problem with this title because what the fuck do you mean female impersonator? You're impersonating a biological sex? Wow, you're so talented. I know that female here is used to mean woman, as in a person that impersonates women, but that makes it even worse. You shouldn't equate female and woman, especially not in a queer space. It's stupid either way you look at it. This title and its use, as the authors show in the book, came from this lack of respect for drag queens. So most popular acts we would now consider drag queens would call themselves something different. As Drag Race has changed, so have its standards. I want to take a moment here to talk about the judges on Drag Race. The authors write, quote, the judging panel on Drag Race evolved over the show's first decade, but it always made sure to keep a fashion expert on it. In the initial seasons, fashion journalist Merle Ginsburg handled the co-judging, along with former Project Runway finalist and independent fashion designer Santina Rice. When Michelle Visage came along, she brought a more showbiz point of view, as well as a closer tie to the drag balls, since she'd spent her youth walking the balls and then touring as part of Seduction. Carson Kressley came onto the panel and brought with him his years of experience as a stylist for major fashion houses, as well as his experience as a fashion commentator and even pageant judge. End quote. I find this bit here a little ironic, especially considering that the authors then applaud the show for moving on from judging queens on realness or how fishy they look, which, yes, it is a good change. But isn't that exactly what the showbiz wants? You think RuPaul would have had as long and as successful of a career without being absolutely stunning and quote-unquote passable in drag? Absolutely not. Furthermore, in those earlier seasons, and I'm going to use season 1 here as an example, it was RuPaul, who was telling Ongina that she looked like a boy and wanted Nina Flowers to be less androgynous from episode 1, while Santino and Merle applauded Ongina and Nina's fashion senses and reference points in drag. When the production realized they wanted BB to win in episode 3, magically after that, Santino and Merle went back on their previous compliments given to Ongina and Nina and also demanded more realness. I covered this in my video about the mistreatment of Ongina and Nina and how the show tried to make viewers dislike them and think that they do dislike them, so check that if you have not already. But back to the passage at hand. Neither Michelle nor Carson are designers. Carson does have a background in being a stylist, but like Violet Chachki said, if you're a stylist who cannot sew, you're a personal buyer. On top of all of that, Michelle's job on the panel is to be the Simon Cowell, the person who will always look for negatives and it will be hard to impress her in order to make Ru look good. Whereas Carson is not a regular judge. He's not always there for the fashion challenges. The authors actually try to criticize Merle and Santino's focus on fashion, but like, they know fashion and design. Of course, that's what they're going to judge. In the earlier seasons, the guest judges were celebrities that related to the challenges. A singer for a singing challenge, a comedian for a stand-up challenge, an actor for an acting challenge, a designer for a design challenge, so that they, professionals in their field, could weigh in on the challenge performances. Michelle, Ross, and Carson try to be presented as jacks of all trades, but most of Michelle and Ross's critiques are nonsensical, because Ross just tries to be funny, often fails, and Michelle tries to be a contrarian, but actually ends up sounding ridiculous. Some aspects of Drag Race have changed for the better, but orienting itself to be more appealing to the showbiz people is not one of their best changes. This book has also explained some of the references that I have missed on the show, or rather, that I did not know were references. Aja played Crystal Abeja on All Stars 3's Snatch Game, and the author is right. Quote, Aja said they felt their legendary read of Valentina in the Season 9 reunion special. Note, this did not happen during the Season 9 reunion, it happened in Untucked. But moving on, was a direct descent of Crystal's form of shade and the kind of long-term rage that inspires it. That specific mix of anger and exhaustion at constantly being othered or less thaned that can often fuel great art or performances. End quote. They also mentioned that Alaska's song Your Makeup is Terrible was based on Crystal's read in the documentary The Queen, which I did not notice, but it seems obvious now that they've mentioned it. Next, during the first ever reading challenge in Season 2, Tyra Sanchez, the first queen to take part in the reading, referenced Venus Extravaganza's iconic line,
Touch this skin, darling. Touch this skin, honey. Touch all of this skin. Okay? You just can't take it. You're just an overgrown orangutan.
when she called Jujubee,
Undergrown orangutan.
and all these years I just thought she was being racist. Well, maybe it's a bit of both. Willam also referenced, or rather quoted, the first part of this line on the show by saying, touch the skin, touch all of the skin. In relation to the previous section of the video, where they mentioned that Michelle Visage took part in the ball scene, I want to read out this passage. Quote, Michelle Visage has her roots in the 1980s New York ball scene, getting her early training and introduction to the art of voguing and walking the balls by legendary choreographer Willie Ninja. She was the first cisgender woman to walk for the balls and was affiliated with the House of Magnifique. After joining Seduction, she can be seen voguing in their 1989 video for their hit It Takes Two, a full year before Madonna released her Vogue video. End quote. Like I've mentioned in my review of the book on Goodreads, the authors call Madonna's song Vogue appropriative. Even though they're adult men, the authors in this book have the same view of culture in the US as a 14-year-old on Twitter who just found out about racial injustice. They start their talk of the club kids by saying it began with young queer artists like James St. James and Michael Alec in the 80s who, quote, came to the city to escape the boring conformity of their white middle and upper class upbringings. End quote. The authors are very complimentary of pageants and balls, which they will proudly tell you became iconic only when they became Black and Latinx only spaces, and they often say that they, as well as all other aspects of drag, constantly borrow from pop culture and other art forms. So then, the only movement in this book that the authors define by white people, even though it is not that in reality, they say that it, quote, stole from punk, new wave, goth, and drag. End quote. It's insane that they don't see their hypocrisy here. To make matters worse, or funnier even, later they say, quote, "The point of the club kid scene was to embrace all types of people. Queer, straight, bi, trans, and drag queens." End quote. First of all, they really expose themselves by listing drag queens next to queer, straight, bi, and trans, but also they're using queer here as a substitute for gay, as in homosexual. However, throughout most of the book, they keep using queer as an umbrella term for non-heterosexual, non-cisgender. On the other hand, they applaud balls and pageants that became race-specific events, which, yes, I know it is so because of racism towards those races, and it was their way to retaliate. But you should not then villainize anything and anyone white. It's also ironic that this book talks about queer life and uses all of these terms like drag, butch, zhuzh, queen, and others, which all come from Polari, UK gay slang, which I don't know if you knew this. UK is a country in Europe with predominantly white people. You can tell that this book was written at a specific point in time of social justice movements because there isn't even a mention of queer Asian people living in the US, or queer Native Americans living on their own land, or non-binary people. The last thing I want to talk about in this book is the chapter on the pit crew and a gay man's view of an ideal look. This chapter is good if you want to read about different artists that pushed the idea of sometimes hairless, sometimes alarmingly hairy, sometimes baby-faced, sometimes giving, oh, you definitely have daddy issues if you go for these types of guys, but always jacked men. Other than that, it's ridiculous. After pages and pages and pages of thirsting over one specific type of a man, the authors write, quote, "The pit crew represents that past, that history, that connection, but it does not represent the be-all and end-all of male beauty." End quote. Yeah, no shit, bitch. We all find different things beautiful, even though you'll have just spent pages upon pages leaving a snail trail when writing about the pit crew and artists who drew, photographed, or wrote about muscular men. Instead of criticizing Drag Race for carrying on this tradition, they do try to backpedal a little bit later when they write, quote, "Think of the pit crew as the end result of that struggle to express queer desire." End quote. And that would have been a good starting point of this chapter. Queer people were not allowed to show desire the same way straight men were allowed to do, and it is actually really amazing that Drag Race allows queens to talk about their boyfriends, husbands, sexual partners, and to, yes, even from time to time be a little raunchy with the pit crew. That's great. That's a big step up. But the problem is that they are always raunchy with the pit crew. The authors are trying to present the concept of the pit crew as subversive when it is not. It would be subversive if the said guys were not all more or less one body type. The authors of the book in many parts of this chapter say that Drag Race is actually poking fun at the gay male standard of beauty, but it's not. It's just conforming to it. On top of that, the pit crew is basically Ẓехploitation. Oh, but it's their choice to do that. Sure, okay, yeah, nobody's forcing those men to be in their underwear on national television, but should we even have a figure on national television be in their underwear and simply a sex object? Not to be that person, but imagine if it were straight men and the pit crew were women. And listen, I'm not taking a stance here that's, think of the children. I'm thinking more of a think of the people that are actually the pit crew stance. Wouldn't it be more subversive if they have put these clearly jacked dudes into suits that are maybe a little too small, so they're ripping at the seams? For example, other Drag Race franchises have had more diverse pit crews and have been less gross about them than the main franchise. For all of the things the show has done to change with times and adapt its appeal to a broader audience, this one thing they have chosen to keep. Goddamn. All in all, I hate writing conclusions. Is this book worth your time or money? No. Not really. Like I've said many times, it's riddled with errors for information that can be easily checked, so it puts a lot of the things written about important figures in US's queer culture into question. The further reading part of the book is lovely because it will actually lead you to sources for, further exploration, but that can be found on many places on the internet. The title of the book does not even accurately describe what it's about, and it uses Drag Race just as a marketing tactic, rather than have it be an actual point of exploration and analysis. analysis, because the existence of this show is a huge leap for queer people in the US, and due to the internet and the general availability of it around the world, it trickles down into every part of the globe. Somebody get me a book deal.